on the afternoon of a Friday in November of 1979, the precise date of which would never be publicly established by any subsequent United States government investigation. A 35-year-old special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation named Robert Philip Hanssen, who had been assigned 8 months earlier in March of that same year to the Counterintelligence Squad of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New York field office, with the specific operational responsibility of identifying and recruiting Soviet intelligence officers operating undercover at the Soviet Union's Manhattan-based diplomatic and commercial installations, walked through the front door of the Manhattan offices of the Soviet Trade Organization, known by the Russian-language acronym AMTORG, at 240 Madison Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, and handed the surprised Soviet duty officer at the reception desk a package containing a typewritten note offering his services as a clandestine asset to the Glavnoye Razvedivatelnoye Upravlenie, the General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Armed Forces of the Soviet Union, known by its Russian acronym GRU. He walked back out onto Madison Avenue. He returned that afternoon to the Federal Bureau of Investigation New York field office at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan, where he signed back in through the security turnstiles using his employee badge and resumed his afternoon of work in the New York Counterintelligence Squad office. He did not, that afternoon or any subsequent afternoon for the next 22 years and 3 months, fail to come to work. The package he had left at the AMTORG reception desk contained, in addition to the typewritten offer of services, the identity of at least one Soviet intelligence officer then operating as a Federal Bureau of Investigation human asset inside the Soviet Union, a senior General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate Major General named Dmitry Fedorovich Polyakov, who had been working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation under the operational cryptonym Topet since 1961, and who would 8 years later, in March of 1988, be executed by firing squad at Lefortovo prison in Moscow. The operation that began that afternoon would last 22 years. It would result in the compromise of approximately 6,000 pages of classified United States intelligence documents and approximately 26 computer disks, the betrayal of at least 3 confirmed Soviet intelligence officers operating as American assets, the operational collapse of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Soviet double agent program, the disclosure of the existence of a classified Federal Bureau of Investigation electronic surveillance tunnel constructed beneath the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., the disclosure of the United States government's classified continuity of government planning for nuclear war, and what would be characterized in the report of the Independent Commission chaired by the former Federal Bureau of Investigation and Central Intelligence Agency Director William H. Webster in March of 2002 as the most damaging human intelligence betrayal in the recorded history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It would pay Robert Hanssen in cash, in diamonds, in Rolex watches, and in escrowed Moscow bank account credits a total of approximately $2.2 million. Robert Philip Hanssen had been born in the Norwood Park neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, on the 18th of April, 1944. His father, Howard Hanssen, had been a Chicago Police Department officer who would later be assigned to the department's Soviet espionage squad. His mother, Vivian Hanssen, had been a homemaker. Howard Hanssen had been, by the subsequent documented account of every person who knew the Hanssen family during Robert's childhood and adolescence, emotionally abusive toward his only son throughout the entirety of Robert's upbringing. Robert had attended the William Howard Taft High School in Northwest Chicago and had graduated in 1962. He had earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in chemistry from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, in 1966. He had enrolled in the autumn of the same year at the Northwestern University School of Dentistry in Chicago, but had withdrawn from the dentistry program after approximately 3 years and had completed instead, in 1971, a Northwestern University Master of Business Administration degree with a specialization in accounting and information systems. He had married Bernadette Walk, known to her family, her husband, and her 6 future children by the Irish diminutive Bonnie, at a Catholic ceremony in Park Ridge, Illinois, on the 9th of August, 1968. He had, on his marriage, converted from his original family Lutheran denomination to Roman Catholicism. He would, over the subsequent decade, become a devout Catholic of an unusually traditionalist character, joining the Roman Catholic personal prelature Opus Dei, attending daily Mass, enrolling his sons at the Heights School and his daughters at the Oakcrest School, both Opus Dei-affiliated private schools in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and becoming, in the subsequent assessment of his Opus Dei spiritual director and of the Catholic school administrators who taught his children, one of the more conspicuous lay Catholics of his Northern Virginia parish community. He had been hired by the Chicago Police Department in 1972 as an internal affairs investigator specializing in forensic accounting analysis of police officer financial misconduct cases. He had worked at the Chicago Police Department for approximately 3.5 years. He had been hired by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a special agent on the 12th of January 1976 at the age of 31. His first Federal Bureau of Investigation field assignment had been to the small Gary, Indiana field office, where he had served for approximately 2 years. He had been transferred in 1978 to the Federal Bureau of Investigation New York field office, where he had been assigned in March of 1979 to the New York Counterintelligence Squad. The walk-in to the Amtorg trade office on Madison Avenue in November of 1979 took place approximately 8 months after that Counterintelligence Squad assignment. It produced, over the subsequent 5 months between November of 1979 and the spring of 1980, approximately $20,000 in cash payments from the Soviet GRU to Robert Hanssen. It produced, in the spring of 1980, what would in retrospect become one of the most consequential undocumented domestic confessions in the history of American counterintelligence. Story is real. Bonnie Hanssen discovered the GRU letters by accident. The Hanssen family was living, in the spring of 1980, in a small suburban house in the Westchester County village of Scarsdale, New York, where Robert had relocated the family after his transfer from Gary. Bonnie, who was at the time the mother of 3 small children, Jane, Sue, and Jack, the eldest, then 10 years old, was sorting through a stack of papers Robert had been keeping in a small file box in the basement workshop when she came across a sequence of handwritten letters addressed to her husband at an unfamiliar Manhattan post office box and signed in transliterated Cyrillic characters by a person identifying himself only by the initial B. She read the letters. She understood by the end of the 3rd letter what she was looking at. She confronted her husband at the kitchen table that evening after the 3 children had been put to bed. Robert Hanssen, in the subsequent kitchen table confrontation, denied that the contents of the letters represented genuine espionage. He told his wife that he had been scamming the GRU, providing them with low-value or fabricated material in exchange for cash payments that he had been using, he said, to supplement the family's modest household budget. He told her that he would stop. Bonnie did not accept the explanation. She required, as a condition of her continuing in the marriage, that her husband confess the matter formally to a Catholic priest in the Opus Dei-affiliated parish, at which the family was at the time attending Mass. He agreed. He confessed the matter on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1980 to an Opus Dei priest named Father Robert Bucciarelli in New Rochelle, New York. Father Bucciarelli, after consultation with his superiors in the Opus Dei prelature, prescribed the following spiritual remedy. Robert Hanssen would cease, with immediate effect, all further contact with Soviet intelligence. He would donate the entirety of the GRU payments he had received over the preceding 5 months to a Catholic charity. Father Bucciarelli specified the Missionaries of Charity, the religious order founded by Mother Teresa of Calcutta. He would never again, under any circumstance, engage in further espionage against the United States. Father Bucciarelli did not, in his subsequent priestly judgment, report the matter to any civil authority. Bonnie Hanssen accepted Father Bucciarelli's spiritual resolution. The marriage continued. Robert Hanssen ceased all contact with the GRU. He did not, however, donate the full GRU payments to the Missionaries of Charity. He retained an undocumented portion of the cash for his own use. He resumed espionage for the first time 5 years and 6 months later. On the 1st of October 1985, Robert Hanssen, by then a 41-year-old Federal Bureau of Investigation Supervisory Special Agent, transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Headquarters Soviet Analytical Unit in Washington, D.C., and recently relocated with his wife and by then 4 children to a small house in the Vienna, Virginia suburb, mailed an anonymous letter from a Prince George's County, Maryland mailbox to the residential address of a 36-year-old Soviet diplomat named Viktor Mikhailovich Degtyaryar on Beauregard Drive in Alexandria, Virginia. Viktor Degtyaryar was, by his cover identity, a press officer at the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street Northwest in Washington. By his true affiliation, he was a line public relations officer of the KGB Washington residency. The outer envelope of Hanssen's mailing was addressed to Degtyaryar at his Alexandria home address. The inner envelope, sealed inside the outer, was marked with the following handwritten instruction: "Do not open. Take this envelope unopened to Viktor Cherkashin." Viktor Ivanovich Cherkashin was, in October of 1985, the line counterintelligence chief of the KGB Washington residency. He was the same KGB officer who, 6 months earlier on the 17th of May, 1985, had handed a Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence branch chief named Aldrich Hazen Ames an envelope containing $50,000 in cash at a Washington area lunch meeting. Viktor Degtyaryar followed the instructions on Hanssen's inner envelope. He delivered the unopened envelope to Cherkashin at the Soviet embassy on the 4th of October, 1985. Cherkashin opened it. The letter inside requested, as initial payment for the operational relationship, $100,000. It identified, as proof of the writer's access to authentic United States intelligence material, the true names and operational cryptonyms of 3 Soviet intelligence officers then working as American assets, the same 3 Soviet officers Aldrich Ames had, by coincidence, separately compromised in his own big dump material delivered to Cherkashin's predecessor channels 3.5 months earlier on the 13th of June, 1985. The 3 Soviet officers were Sergei Mikhailovich Motorin, a KGB officer operating undercover at the Soviet embassy in Washington; Valery Fyodorovich Martinov, a second KGB officer operating undercover at the same Soviet embassy; and Boris Yuzhin, a KGB officer who had previously operated undercover at the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. Sergei Motorin was recalled to Moscow on a manufactured pretext in late 1985. He was arrested on arrival. He was executed by firing squad in February of 1987. Valery Martinov was recalled to Moscow in November of 1985 to serve as part of the official Soviet diplomatic escort returning the defector Vitaly Yurchenko to Moscow following Yurchenko's redefection. He was arrested upon arrival. He was executed by firing squad on the 28th of May, 1987. Boris Yuzhin was arrested in 1986. He received a 15-year sentence at a Soviet labor colony. He was amnestied during the late Gorbachev-era political reforms in 1992. He subsequently emigrated to the United States. The letter Hanssen had mailed to Viktor Degtyaryar's residence on the 1st of October, 1985, was signed only with the single Cyrillic letter that he would use as his operational designator across the subsequent 15 years of correspondence with the KGB and the SVR. He never, in the subsequent 22 years and 3 months of the operation, revealed his true name to his Soviet handlers. He never met any of them in person. He communicated throughout the entirety of the operation by dead drops and signal sites in the wooded suburban parks of the Northern Virginia residential communities around his home in Vienna. The KGB and the SVR assigned operational cryptonyms to each of the 8 principal dead drop sites Hanssen used over the operational period. The most frequently used site, codenamed Park and subsequently Prime, was located beneath a small wooden footbridge in Nottoway Park in Vienna, Virginia, 3/4 of a mile from Hanssen's house on Talisman Drive. The site was used by Hanssen and his Soviet handlers approximately 17 times across the 22 years. A second site, codenamed Ellis, was located beneath a small wooden footbridge over Wolf Trap Creek in Foxstone Park, Vienna, Virginia, slightly more than 1 mile from Hanssen's house. The Ellis site would, on the 18th of February 2001, become the location of Hanssen's arrest. 6 additional sites, Biob in Idlewood Park, Charlie in Eakin Community Park, and Doris, Fellow, Grace, and Helen at additional locations across the broader Northern Virginia park system completed the rotation. The operational tradecraft of the dead drops was as follows. Hanssen would prepare a small package of classified documents wrapped in a black plastic trash bag and sealed with duct tape. He would drive his Volkswagen, and later, after the family budget upgrade in the late 1990s, a used Ford Taurus to the designated park. He would place the trash bag in the prearranged concealment location beneath the footbridge or in the underbrush. He would then drive to a designated signal site, typically a wooden park signpost or a metal utility pole on a nearby suburban street, and would apply a small piece of white adhesive tape to the post in a designated orientation to confirm that the drop was loaded. He would then drive home. A KGB or SVR officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet D and later Russian an embassy in Washington would, within 72 hours of the signal, retrieve the trash bag and leave a corresponding return package, typically containing Hanssen's payment in cash or diamonds, at the same site. The total document volume Hanssen transferred to the Soviet and subsequently Russian intelligence services across the 22-year operation was approximately 6,000 pages of classified material plus approximately 26 computer disks containing additional classified files. The content of the transferred material included, in addition to the identification of the 3 KGB officers in the original October 1985 letter, the following major categories. The existence of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's classified electronic surveillance tunnel beneath the Soviet OPA, and after 1991, the Russian Moscow Embassy on 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. The tunnel, known by its bureau cryptonym Operation Monopoly, had been constructed jointly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Security Agency at a cost subsequently estimated at several $100 million. It had been intended as a primary technical intelligence collection asset against Soviet diplomatic communications throughout the late Cold War period. Hanssen disclosed the existence and location of the tunnel to the KGB in September of 1989. He received a payment in October of 1989 of $55,000 for the disclosure. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Assistant Director for National Security John F. Lewis would subsequently testify before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that the tunnel had, following Hanssen's disclosure, produced no information of any kind over the remainder of its operational life. The identity of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's investigation against a State Department political officer named Felix Bloch, who had been suspected by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1989 of espionage on behalf of the KGB. Hanssen disclosed the existence of the Bloch investigation to the KGB in May of 1989. The KGB immediately broke contact with Bloch. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's case against Bloch collapsed without prosecution. The complete operational architecture of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Soviet double agent program, including the true identities of every bureau-recruited Soviet asset, then operating against Soviet and East European intelligence targets, the operational methods by which those assets had been recruited, and the analytic and tasking protocols by which the Bureau managed their continuing collection activity. The United States government's classified continuity of government planning protocols, which detailed the procedures by which the senior leadership of the United States executive and legislative branches would be relocated to undisclosed secure locations in the event of a Soviet nuclear strike against Washington, D.C., a detailed catalog of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's broader Counterintelligence Division operational priorities, the analytic methodology of the Bureau's National Security Threat List, and the operational tasking protocols of the Bureau's National Human Intelligence Collection Program. The total compensation Robert Hanssen received from the KGB and the SVR across the 22-year period by the subsequent reconstruction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation post-arrest damage assessment was approximately $1,400,000 in cash payments, diamond payments, and Rolex watch payments delivered through the dead drop infrastructure, plus an additional $800,000 held in an escrow account at a Moscow bank that the KGB and subsequently the SVR maintained for him, and that he never collected. The aggregate of $2.2 million represented, on a per-page basis, approximately $366 per classified document page transferred. Hanssen's day-to-day lifestyle throughout the 22 years of the operation did not change in any way that was visible to the Federal Bureau of Investigation supervisory personnel under whom he served, to the Vienna, Virginia neighbors who lived on his block of Talisman Drive, or to the Opus Dei parish community at which he and Bonnie attended daily mass. He continued to drive the same modest used cars. He continued to live in the same mortgaged Vienna house. He continued to send his children to the same Catholic schools. He continued to wear the same off-the-rack suits to his Federal Bureau of Investigation duty station. He did not, however, donate the money to the missionaries of charity. He spent it in part on a Washington, D.C. area exotic dancer named Priscilla Sue Gailey. Robert Hanssen had met Priscilla Gailey at a strip club called Joanna's 1819 on M Street Northwest in Washington in the spring of 1990. He had become emotionally yawned, though, by the subsequent contemporaneous account of every party involved, not sexually fixated on her. He had given her, over the subsequent 18 months, an aggregate of approximately $80,000 in cash, a used silver Mercedes-Benz 190 sedan, a sapphire necklace, and access to an American Express credit card under his name. He had attempted, with limited success, to convert her to Roman Catholicism. He had given her a rosary. He had taken her, in the autumn of 1991, on a Federal Bureau of Investigation Inspection Division business trip to Hong Kong, arranging, through a combination of personal funds and per diem manipulations, for her airfare and her hotel accommodation in the same building in which he was staying for the official bureau business of the trip. The Gailey relationship ended in 1993 when Gailey I, who had developed a serious crack cocaine dependency over the preceding 18 months, was arrested in Florida on a possession-related charge unrelated to her relationship with Hanssen, and was subsequently sentenced to several years in Florida State Prison. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Inspection Division, which had certified the Hong Kong trips per diem reimbursement in 1991 without any procedural concern, did not, during or after the Gailey relationship, conduct any internal bureau review of the financial or personal circumstances of Special Agent Robert Hanssen. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Joint Counterintelligence mole hunt that ultimately identified Robert Hanssen began in the spring of 1994 in the immediate aftermath of the arrest of the Central Intelligence Agency officer Aldrich Hazen Ames at his Arlington, Virginia home on the morning of the 21st of February, 1994. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency, in the joint damage assessment that followed Ames's arrest, concluded that the catastrophic collapse of the United States-Soviet intelligence program between 1985 and 1986 could not have been caused by Ames alone. They concluded, by the late spring of 1994, that an additional unidentified human source, referred to in the Joint Task Force internal correspondence by the cryptonym Gray Suit, had been operating inside the United States intelligence community in parallel with Ames throughout the 1980s. The Joint Task Force conducted what would become, over the following 6.5 years, the most operationally disastrous misidentification of a counterintelligence target in the modern history of the United States intelligence community. The task force concluded, on the basis of a sequence of overlapping analytic inferences derived from the access patterns of the compromised Soviet operational material, that Gray Suit was a Central Intelligence Agency officer named Brian Joseph Kelly. Brian Kelly was, at the time of the task force's identification of him, a 56-year-old Central Intelligence Agency Soviet/East European Division counterintelligence officer with 24 years of service. He was a Catholic. He was a widower. He was a single father of 3 grown children. Between 1998 and the autumn of 2000, the Joint Federal Bureau of Investigation and Central Intelligence Agency Task Force subjected Brian Kelly to approximately 2 years of continuous physical surveillance of his home, his car, his daily commute, and his work activity at the Central Intelligence Agency Langley headquarters. The task force placed covert listening devices in his home. The task force interviewed his 3 grown children, his elderly mother, and several of his Catholic parish friends under pretexts. The task force ran an elaborate counterintelligence sting in which a Bureau special agent posed as a Russian intelligence officer and approached Kelly at his front door, presenting himself as an emergency contact from a Soviet handler Kelly had never had. Brian Kelly did not respond to the sting. He maintained throughout the entire 2-year ordeal of the surveillance and the interviews that he was an innocent counterintelligence officer and that he was being mistakenly investigated. He was placed on administrative leave by the Central Intelligence Agency in the autumn of 1999. He was relieved of his security clearance. He was, by the spring of 2000, prepared for an indictment. He was, by the assessment of every Federal Bureau of Investigation and Central Intelligence Agency officer who participated in the gray suit investigation between 1998 and the autumn of 2000, guilty. He was, in fact, innocent. The Federal Bureau of Investigation mole hunt veteran who eventually broke the gray suit investigation out of its 2-year misidentification was a Bureau Supervisory Special Agent named Michael Rochford, who had been working on Soviet counterintelligence at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Washington Field Office since 1985. Rochford concluded by the late summer of 2000 that the gray suit investigation against Brian Kelly had become a closed analytic loop and that the only path to a definitive resolution lay in obtaining the actual operational file the KGB and SVR had maintained on the unidentified American mole. He persuaded the Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Louis Freeh and through Freeh the Central Intelligence Agency Director George Tenet to authorize a single one-time joint agency cash payment of $7 million to a former KGB officer, subsequently identified in the late journalist David Wise's posthumously published 2018 book, The $7 Million Spy, as a man operating under the cover name Alexander Shcherbakov, who had agreed through an intermediary cutout to deliver to the Federal Bureau of Investigation the complete KGB and SVR operational file on the unidentified American mole, codenamed B. The file was delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in November of 2000. It contained, among other materials, an audio recording of a single 1986 phone conversation between the mole and a KGB officer. The recording was played in a small windowless conference room at Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Washington, D.C. on the morning of the 18th of November, 2000, before a panel of 3 senior Federal Bureau of Investigation counterintelligence officers who had personally known and worked alongside Robert Hanssen for periods ranging from 9 to 19 years. The 3 officers identified the voice on the recording within the first 41 seconds of playback as the voice of Special Agent Robert Philip Hanssen of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Soviet Analytical Unit. The file also contained a single latent fingerprint, lifted by the KGB from the inside surface of a plastic trash bag the mole had used in a dead drop in approximately 1995. The fingerprint matched the right thumbprint on file in the Federal Bureau of Investigation personnel record of Robert Philip Hanssen. The Federal Bureau of Investigation transferred Robert Hanssen in late January of 2001 from his then-current State Department liaison post to a newly created supervisory position at Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Washington, titled the Information Assurance Section of the Counterintelligence Division, a position created specifically and exclusively for the purpose of placing Hanssen in a controlled office environment in which the Bureau could surveil his daily operational behavior in real time. The Bureau assigned, as Hanssen's nominal new operational assistant, a 27-year-old Federal Bureau of Investigation investigative specialist named Eric O'Neill, who had been recruited from the Bureau's Special Surveillance Group and who had been informed of the true nature of his assignment in a private off-site meeting with the section's bureau supervisor the week before. Over the subsequent 4 weeks between late January and mid-February of 2001, Eric O'Neill worked in Hanssen's small headquarters office. He observed Hanssen's daily routine, He noted Hanssen's habitual carrying of a Palm 3 personal digital assistant on his person during all working hours. He noted that Hanssen never, in his daily routine, left the Palm 3 unattended in the office. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 15th of February 2001, while Robert Hanssen was on a brief headquarters meeting with the Counterintelligence Division Assistant Director, Eric O'Neill, acting on the operational instruction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Special Surveillance Group Supervisor, removed the Palm 3 from the briefcase Hanssen had left in his unattended office, carried it through the headquarters corridors to a small adjacent conference room, where two Federal Bureau of Investigation Technical Services agents were waiting, transferred the device to the agents, returned to Hanssen's office, and waited. The Technical Services agents downloaded, in approximately 17 minutes, the entire encrypted contents of the Palm 3. The contents included Hanssen's operational notes for an upcoming dead drop scheduled for the evening of Sunday, the 18th of February 2001, at the Ellis site beneath the wooden footbridge over Wolf Trap Creek in Foxstone Park, Vienna, Virginia. Eric O'Neill returned the Palm 3 to Hanssen's briefcase before Hanssen returned to the office at 4:11 in the afternoon. The arrest of Robert Philip Hanssen took place on the evening of Sunday, the 18th of February 2001, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon in Foxstone Park, Vienna, Virginia. Robert Hanssen drove to the park from the Talisman Drive house. He parked his white Ford Taurus in the small gravel parking area on Creek Crossing Road. He walked, carrying a black plastic trash bag containing approximately 7 classified Federal Bureau of Investigation documents, into the woods toward the wooden footbridge over Wolf Trap Creek. He placed the trash bag beneath the footbridge in the prearranged concealment location. He walked back along the trail toward his car. He stopped at a small wooden park signpost, approximately 100 yards from the parking area. He applied a small piece of white adhesive tape to the post. He continued walking back toward his car. At approximately the moment Robert Hanssen reached the gravel parking area where his Ford Taurus was parked, approximately 15 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents in plainclothes, who had been positioned in concealed locations throughout Foxstone Park since shortly after noon that afternoon, emerged from the surrounding tree line and surrounded him. The agents identified themselves. They informed Robert Hanssen that he was under arrest for espionage against the United States on behalf of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. Robert Hanssen, by the contemporaneous account of the arresting agents and by his own subsequent post-arrest debriefing statements, did not resist. He said, after the senior arresting agent had completed the standard arrest notification, "What took you so long?" A second Federal Bureau of Investigation team, positioned at a nearby dead drop signal site along Foxstone Park Road, simultaneously recovered a $50,000 cash payment that the SVR Washington residency had left at the corresponding return signal site for Hanssen earlier that afternoon. Robert Philip Hanssen was charged in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia on a 21-count indictment returned in May of 2001, with 13 counts of espionage in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 794, 1 count of attempted espionage, 1 count of conspiracy to commit espionage, and additional related counts. He pleaded guilty on the 6th of July, 2001, before Judge Claude M. Hilton of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia in Alexandria, Virginia, to 15 of the 21 indicted counts, comprising 13 counts of espionage, 1 count of attempted espionage, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit espionage. His defense counsel was the 72-year-old Washington, D.C. criminal defense attorney Plato Caceres, who had 3 years earlier represented the Central Intelligence Agency espionage defendant Aldrich Hazen Ames in the same federal courthouse. The plea agreement, negotiated between Caceres and the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia, provided for a sentence of 15 consecutive life terms in federal prison without the possibility of parole, in exchange for Hanssen's full and continuing cooperation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Post-Arrest Damage Assessment Debriefing Program, and in exchange for the United States government's agreement that the surviving spouse Bonnie Hanssen would retain a 55% survivor's annuity from his Federal Bureau of Investigation pension. The family home, at 9414 Talisman Drive in Vienna, Virginia, and 3 of the family's vehicles. He was sentenced on the 10th of May, 2002 by Judge Claude Hilton. He was assigned to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons and to the population of inmates housed there as ADX Florence, the most restrictive federal correctional institution operated by the United States government. He was held in solitary confinement in a single windowless 7-foot by 12-foot cell for 23 hours of every day for the subsequent 21 years. He died at ADX Florence at approximately 6:55 in the morning, Mountain Daylight Time, on Monday the 5th of June, 2023, of complications related to colon cancer. He was 79 years old. He had served 21 years and 25 days of his 15 consecutive life sentences. What the case of Robert Philip Hanssen exposed, and what the Webster Commission report of March 2002 and the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General Special Report of August 2003 independently confirmed, was a structural failure inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence Division of a depth, a duration, and a systemic character that the Bureau had not previously been required in its institutional history to confront. The Webster Commission concluded that Hanssen had escaped detection for 22 years, not because of any extraordinary sophistication of his operational tradecraft, but because the Federal Bureau of Investigation had, throughout the entirety of those 22 years, declined to subject any special agent of the Bureau, including those agents operating in positions of the highest counterintelligence access, to the standard polygraph examination protocol that the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency had been administering to their cleared personnel since the 1950s. Robert Hanssen had never, in his 25 years of Federal Bureau of Investigation service, been polygraphed. The Webster Commission further documented that Bonnie Hanssen's older brother, Mark Walk, who had been a Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent assigned to the Bureau's Chicago field office since 1983 dogs, had reported to a senior Federal Bureau of Investigation supervisor in August of 1990 after Bonnie had told him during a family visit that she had discovered approximately $5,000 in unexplained cash in her husband's dresser drawer. His concern that Robert Hanssen might be operating as a foreign intelligence asset. The Federal Bureau of Investigation supervisor to whom Mark Walk reported the concern, whose name was redacted from the public version of the Webster Commission report, dismissed the report. The report was not entered into any Federal Bureau of Investigation analytic system. It was not referenced in any subsequent internal Bureau personnel review of Special Agent Robert Hanssen. It was located only in 2001 in the course of the post-arrest internal Bureau document review conducted by the Webster Commission staff. Eric O'Neill, the 27-year-old Federal Bureau of Investigation investigative specialist who had removed the Palm 3 from Robert Hanssen's office briefcase on the afternoon of the 15th of February, 2001, resigned from the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the summer of 2001. He attended law school. He has, in the subsequent 2 decades, operated a small cybersecurity consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and has written a memoir of the Hanssen surveillance operation titled Gray Day, published by Crown in 2019. The Hollywood film Breach, released in 2007, was based on his account of the operation, with the actor Ryan Phillippe playing him, and the actor Chris Cooper playing Robert Hanssen. Brian Kelly, the Central Intelligence Agency counterintelligence officer who had been wrongly identified as the mole code-named Gray Suit and surveilled by the Federal Bureau of Investigations and Central Intelligence Agency Joint Task Force for approximately 2 years between 1998 and the autumn of 2000, received a formal written apology from Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Robert Mueller in late 2001. He was restored to his Central Intelligence Agency position and his security clearance. He returned to the agency for a small number of years before retiring. He died of a heart attack at his Vienna, Virginia home in September of 2011, age 68. Aldrich Hasten Ames, the Central Intelligence Agency Counterintelligence Branch Chief, whose own February 21st, 1994 arrest had triggered the joint mole hunt
that ultimately identified Robert Hanssen, died of natural causes at the Federal Correctional Institution at Cumberland, Maryland on the 5th of January, 2026, 2.5 years after Hanssen's own death at AW Florence.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation, since the conclusion of the Webster Commission report in 2002, and the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General Special Report in 2003, has subjected every Bureau special agent, every Bureau analyst, and every Bureau support employee with access to classified national security information to a standardized polygraph examination protocol on a recurring schedule of every 5 years. It has not, since the implementation of that protocol, identified another mole inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the operational scale of Robert Philip Hanssen. What it has identified in the recurring polygraph reviews of the subsequent 2 decades was, in the assessment of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence Division supervisors who have testified before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence on the implementation of the program since 2003, where, substantially less than it could plausibly have identified between 1976 and 2001. If the program had been implemented at any point during the prior 25 years, Robert Philip Hanssen had walked into the Manhattan offices of the Soviet trade organization Amtorg at 240 Madison Avenue on an unrecorded Friday afternoon in November of 1979. He had walked back out that afternoon, having handed the duty officer at the reception desk the operational identity of a Soviet General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate Major General named Dmitry Polyakov, who had been working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1961. He had returned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation New York field office. He had signed back in through the security turnstiles. He had resumed his afternoon of work. The United States intelligence community had not, for the next 21 years and 3 months, looked